Right, so is this thing on? Can you hear me? Okay, can you hear me? Okay, great. So welcome to Achaia Arts and Book Festival 2018. My name is Pernille Nailor, and I will be moderating the panel discussion titled The Intricacies of Afropolitanism with Panashe Chigumadzi, Aderonke Adeola, and Ade Bantu. So Aderonke is the writer, director, and producer of the documentary Awani, A Colonial History of Women. And the documentary will be shown at, is it 6 p.m.?
Straight after this, so okay, I hope to see some of you.
Yeah, so a bit of shameless advertising here. Make sure that you stick around afterwards. Panashe is the founder and editor of Vanguard magazine, and her second book, These Bones Will Rise Again, came out recently, and I think that's available at the bookshop as well, so make sure you check that out. We continue with the advertising here. Ade is the frontman of the 13-piece band Bantu and producer of the Lagos-based concert series Afropolitan Vibes. Right, so I think we're just going to get started here. Since Afropolitanism was popularized roughly 10 to 15 years ago, the concept has caused heated debates. Much like in conversations on other terms, we see an ongoing process of definition and redefinition. So on this note, my first question is to you, Ade. You work with the term in your Lagos-based concert series. I'd like to hear what motivated you to use it and how you define it.
Well, okay. I grew up in Nigeria, but I spent a great deal of time in Germany, and obviously being involved in different movements in Germany and trying to make white folks understand that we are German, although we're black. We came up with different terminology, so we moved from Afro-German to Afropian, and at some point, Afropolitan was being thrown at us. I think I used the term for the music series and concert series and festival that we've been running for about 6 years, because I was a bit disturbed by the fact that I felt like there was a conversation going on in the literary world and in certain circles, and it wasn't being taken back home. And I felt like, what will happen if you take this term and you take it to the streets and people claim it? So we started this concert series in Lagos Island, downtown Lagos, and we gave it back to the people. That's what we did, and I just said, okay, we have to infuse another energy, another understanding of that word, and so I put vibes, so it's Afropolitan vibes, that's simple.
And how would you define it then?
How would I define? I think urban Africans are very complex people, and complexity is part of who we are, and it's a beautiful thing because a lot of layers, and I just think a lot of people use that term to sell to white establishments, privileged few who write for a white audience, who want to be in the feuilletons and all of that. So they know it's a calculated move, and it works, The white establishment, it's all about trying to find the next hip black thing, and everyone jumped on it, And then when certain people embraced it, as writers, filmmakers, and most of them were practicing from outside the continent, but always using the continent to sell whatever product. I just find it very, very worrisome.
Thank you. So if we move on to our other two speakers, how would you define the word? And so what does it mean to be Afropolitan, for instance, in your opinion?
Personally, I find it fairly ambiguous, and I understand why. I understand the reasons behind the need for a new name, especially if you're based in a Western region, a Western context. However, I'm not sure again, in defining it, I sort of see it as a hierarchical, fairly classist, perhaps Africans with two passports, one in Europe, one in Africa, or one in Europe, or one in America, and they're in a certain demographic, and I as you can tell, I'm not a big fan of it.
Okay, and how about over here?
I mean, I really struggled. I was wondering, why am I in this panel? Because I've never written about Afropolitanism. I've never really had a stake in the debate, and as far as it's always been something that's really bored me, or in the sense that I felt like it's not something that spoke to my experiences. So the first thing I guess I would have to say with this debate is that, one, I'm not an Afropolitan. I'm a Pan-Africanist, if that's where the positions, if I have to stake somewhere, that's where I lie within the debate. But two, speaking from the position of being a black woman who was born in Zimbabwe, grew up in South Africa, and recently moved to the States, and literally 2 months, so that feels weird to be claiming. It's not a position being on the continent. It felt like this is a conversation for Africans outside the continent. This was for Africans in the West looking for a way to relate to the continent in a way that was still palatable to whiteness and to the West. For me, what was really frustrating with the conversation particularly is that when I'm being very reductive or dismissive about it, it felt like African-flavored Western whatever. So if I put kente fabric on it, it's now African. If I do, it's kind of, how do I live my best Western life while being on the continent, for example? I felt that it often produced a lot of very derivative kinds of cultures. So this has to be, I don't know, I once saw, it could be an African version of Girls, an African version of 1, 2, 3. So it's always about how do I show that I can do a lot of these things that are in the West on the continent. And I think for me, what's frustrating about this conversation is, one, its political stance. It's a particularly kind of neoliberal, apolitical, post-national. So in the same way that you have the post-racial debate, a lot of the Afropolitan debate is about how we've moved beyond the politics of nationalism, for example. We no longer care to speak about colonialism, for example. We don't care about neocolonialism because I've got 2 passports. I can move everywhere. So I don't need to care about some of these issues that some of these boring African writers are still writing about, poverty and whatever, and that kind of thing, they settle themselves down with. And it's a very particularly middle class kind of Afropolitanism, because within this kind of debate, we think about there are many Africans who are writing about moving and migrating, but what about the African who's an asylum seeker? Is that the kind of African who fits into the sexy Afropolitanism or not? Someone like a Brian Chikwava, his book Harare North, is that person who is living under the radar and not moving with ease and is forced to stay within their apartment in London because they're not sure if they're going to get stopped by the police. Is that an Afropolitan, or is it someone who you're going to have the martini with as you're stopping on the way to Davos, for example? So that's why I've never been interested in the Afropolitan neoliberal agenda. And on top of it, it's also very, very ahistorical. Africans have been traveling within the continent for a very long time, so it erases the migration of Africans within the continent. Someone like Zugiswa, for example, born, I think, in Zambia, grew up in Zimbabwe, actually went to school in Hawaii, then was now living in Nairobi. That's not someone who is in the imagination of an Afropolitanism, because it has to be done in the West. So this fetishism of the West is frustrating, but also people like Ama Ataidu with Sister Killjoy. She was speaking about going to the West, but the particular politics she embodied is very different from the person who just wants to be free of speaking about colonialism. So that's my little rant about Afropolitanism. The politics that it embodies are really ones that are quite offensive to me, and what a lot of us are striving for, at least who are aligned themselves to a Pan-African internationalism. So we want to move within the world, but not with this ahistorical, neoliberal kind of politics.
Thank you. I think you're touching on some really sort of central themes in sort of the discourse of Afropolitanism. One is the issue about style. So you're talking about kente cloth, and that sort of being a signifier of the continent. but not much more than that. And what does it actually mean when it's taken out of its context, for instance? So we've seen many critiques of the term, and in particular of Taye Selassie's Bye Bye Baba, or What is an Afropolitan, an essay which has played an important role in sort of popularizing the term. One of its early critics questioned, or some of its early critics questioned the issue around consumerism and emphasis on style associated with the term. But more recently, some of these critics have also said, well, maybe it is more complex than that. So we have this issue around style, but does it raise some important questions anyway, sort of at the same time? So building on what you were saying, I wonder if our other two panelists could say a bit about that.
I absolutely. I mean, again, if you put Afro in front of something, then it's just sort of a light dusting of the African. You know, it makes it African, and it's extremely reductive, and it takes away the history, the context. I remember about maybe 5-10 years ago, African prints were really in, and they'd call it ethnic prints or tribal prints, and it meant you're completely stripping the story and the narrative away from what it actually is. And it does get it gets a little dangerous for the people who that story is from. And again, my issue with the term Afropolitan in of itself is that why do we need that term? I think we need to ask ourselves who is it for? Is it for fellow Africans? Who are you centering? And why are you centering them? I found something I shared with you just before the session. I found a poem by Chibundu Onuzo, and she says, the New African, there's so much talk of the New African, Afropolitan, cosmopolitan, business ready, champagne heady, Ankara wound, Geneva bound, MBA, CFA, hybrid, at ease everywhere, nowhere. There was nothing wrong with the old African. There was no need to rebrand with brand new stereotypes that will fade in one generation until the next new Africans arrive with fresh irons. We are human, we need no proof. We have a rich history. We have so many identities. It's so complicated. Identity is such a complicated thing. To be African, to be Black, to be Nigerian, to be Ghanaian, to be Zimbabwean, to be Nigerian and German. I'm not a fan of this stripping and the decontextualization.
Thank you. And what about you, Ade? So you're bringing the concept back to Lagos, is what you're saying, right? What's your take on this issue around style and consumerism?
I think for me, what is important, also using Afropolitan within the context of music and trying to identify some kind of Pan-African soundtrack, for lack of a better word, is that a lot of these debates happen and we always exclude the people who it's all about, So it's us writing about it, making hip films about urbanity or all the different layers of our identities. But the common person out there on the streets, we never really get the message across to them. And in a place like Lagos, for example, and around Freedom Park, where we started Afropolitan Vibes, that is the nerve center of commerce, and that is where, the interaction between Europe and Africa kind of occurred and is still occurring, And for me, it's important to make people acknowledge, recognize, and also see that they're part of a global conversation, And if the park attendant in downtown Lagos uses the word Afropolitan in the context of a concert, and then there's some residue somewhere, and it ignites something in him or her, I hope that will also pull them into the conversation. That is what is important to me, because also what we do with our concert series is we're all inclusive. We're very class conscious in Nigeria, and when you go to cultural gatherings, music events. It's very high price, you know. You can't really just afford people sit down. There's the VIP sections. And we break all those barriers, you know. We want everyone to come together. We want the rich guy next to the student, next to the hustler, and everyone has to kind of feel comfortable, you know. And negotiating that is important. So I understand that people have a problem with the term Afropolitan, but what do you do when you have a problem with a term? I expose it, you know, and not only I play with it, because I think there also has to be some kind of playfulness when we're engaging each other, you know, and hopefully through that, through a cultural gathering, a movement, it can also happen. And we also invite artists from all over the world. So we have African American artists, German, Nigerian, German, Dutch, they come here, they perform. You know, I think for me, how do you work with something problematic, you know, and through music, that's what we try to do.
If there's a question I wanted to ask all three of you. I'm interested in, there's this ongoing debate going on in academia. And I'm interested in hearing whether these ideas make sense outside academic discussions. One is that recently academic journal issues, book chapters, and books have been dedicated to the term. So they've been rebooting the term with literary scholars, for instance, in particular, expanding on the meaning or suggesting that we do so. So rather than saying that this is just a signifier of empty consumerism, there's more to it than that. Let's see where we can take it. One claim is that it can be understood as a critical space where people debate various topics concerning Africa and the diaspora. And a key theme here is what it means to live and move across borders in the 21st century for people of different social status. So not just the middle class African diaspora individual. I was wondering whether you find this definition useful and what your take on it is.
So just to clarify a few things, I'll just start with what's wrong with Pan-Africanism. I don't know why we still need to, what is this need to run away from Pan-Africanism? And I find that a lot of this is to do with running away from the politics of decolonization, and that's why we need to come up with these new. And even, by the way, this thing about being a new African, people were talking about being new Africans in the early 20th century, just like we're talking about new Negroes and all of those kinds of things. So again, this constant way in which we always have to, and this is a very colonial thing, that we always have to make ourselves anew. And in order to justify ourselves, you know, so we always have to be new, and to not know our history. So to always make it seem as if you're the first people to fight for feminism, you're the first people to fight for 1, 2, 3, and erase the histories that we've had for a very long time. And I see this happening with this particular debate about Afropolitanism, and it's not something it's not something benign, because if you think about, for example, the appropriation of Fela Kuti, for example, by Afropolitanism, for example, he was not post-nationalist. He was centering a critique of nationalism in his music. That was not, his style was very political. It wasn't just style for style's sake, but now we're going to reduce what Fela Kuti was about as a nice soundtrack to our meeting post-divorce, and now we're going to talk about how Africa's open for business. We just had this debate just now, but the point just being that it's on the back of a particular kind of neoliberal kind of erasure of histories. I think something I wanted to talk about in the last panel was, you know, we talk about how we're opening Africa up for markets. What about Colgate, Coca-Cola, Peers, all these brands that have been in our households for years? For decades within our families, but we're going to pretend as if it's the first time businesses are coming to Africa. So I think there's something about what are we being pushed away from. We need to interrogate why the need for a new term. Why can we not speak about how the struggles might be somewhat different, but it continues? So that's the thing about the way in which Afropolitanism works in the mainstream. So whether it's in academia, so the likes of Mbembe who speak about a post-victim mentality, What does that mean when you say a post-victim mentality? I'm not going to talk about neocolonialism. I'm not going to talk about a whole range of things. So I think that's what the visceral reaction you're getting from me is, why do we always need to be told to look forward as Africans? As we're talking even now about fantastical futures, what I've really loved throughout all the sessions that people have emphasized past, present, and future. And for me, in the way in which Afropolitanism works right now, it's always about future, 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 and disconnecting us from some shameful past that we have. And that's for me what I don't like about this ahistorical aspect and depoliticized, which is actually very political kind of aspect around it. So that's why I push back at many of these academics who are trying to retrofit this thing in, because the politics of, let's say, something like Sister Killjoy, which is an African moving out into the world, is not the same politics as some of what we now would term an Afropolitan novel these days. So that's just I'm saying no to that Afropolitan term. Many of us move across the continent and we have very different politics than what is being trying to be forced down our throats.
And what about you two? Over here.
I'm going to sort of support what Panashe just said. I mean, what does this new term, what does it serve in focusing on it in academia? Why not talk about colonialism? There was an amazing session about Black Britishness. You, Ade Bantu, moderated it. And I think it'd be far more powerful to look at the realities of the past as opposed to creating this field of academia on a word that's not clearly defined. And, you know, we all had Panashe and I, we spoke about it yesterday briefly, well, not really briefly, for a while. And I think the reason why we're having this session on Afropolitanism is because it's so ambiguous. There's no sort of strict definition. And what I like about Afropolitan vibes is that it's very specific. As someone who's been to Afropolitan vibes, in my own opinion, it's showing the plethora of music. You have Burna Boy and Shalewa Benny on the same stage, you know? It's redefining how we experience music. You can be into music from the past and the present, and it's not just for a middle-class demographic. I completely understand it, and I really enjoy it. Personally, but in the field of academia, I feel that there needs to be a bit more honesty and really engaging with our colonial past, our post-colonial present, and whatever the hopefully a non-post free from colonialist future, for lack of a better term. But I think the concise answer to your question is why are we looking at African history, sociology, and culture through the Afropolitan lens, a word that's not clearly defined? It's dangerous. It leads to further ambiguity, and again, I'm not a fan.
Thank you. Elaborating on that, do you think that Afropolitan vibes is able to make it more complex compared to academic discussions?
Absolutely, and I'm not just saying this because Bantu's on the stage. I think for me, the curation of the acts, because there's always someone from, Daddy Shoki, someone from the past, someone from the present, and then up and coming emerging artists. I mean, if we talk about past, present, and future, Afropolitan Vibes is a really great case study for that. And again, it's not linked to Afropolitanism as an African identity, but perhaps a musical experience. So I can define it quite easily as someone who's been to it, who sees the posters, who sees the range of people that attend, from the people collecting money to park your car by force. And whether you want to or not, or you need them to park it or not, or people coming from work, or people who aren't from Nigeria or aren't Nigerian and they've heard of this musical experience. I think it definitely flips it on its head and adds complexity and depth.
I would just like to say, I approached the words with a Pan-Africanist agenda. I knew exactly what I was doing, and it's all about connecting the dots. And for me, as a musician, that is what I try to curate, and educate people around that word. So it's a catchphrase, it's hip. We make the posters look a certain way. Our whole visual aesthetics is very appealing. But then you add content and you add the politics into it, and you force a pop audience that is coming in there because of, say, a Burna Boy to come and deal with Salawa Abeni, and also identify with a part of their culture that sometimes they don't feel is hip, and then also bring a African German rapper who raps in German, and he's on stage and nobody understands what he's saying, but they feel the vibe, So I like breaking things, and I think for me that is the freedom I understand around Afropolitan, and because, as you said, it's ambiguous and there's no real definition. It's like almost holding on to air, like a very bizarre thing. I just felt like, okay, let's just knock it on its head and let's expose its flaws,
Elaborating on what you just said then, you say that you bring all of these different artists from different parts of the world to Lagos. Does that mean then that would you say that people are then able to experience the world from one particular location without necessarily having to move across borders and physically, and then fitting in with that stereotype of the Afropolitan, the highly mobile Afropolitan?
Well, I don't know. We, growing up, I haven't had the privilege to have grown up in Nigeria. I definitely had access to the world. So, and I was always traveling through books, movies, and fashion, and what have you not. So, bringing people back here to experience the world, yeah, but I think that's too far-fetched. For me, what is more important is I feel like all these conversations are not happening in African centers, and that is what is disturbing me sometimes, like a lot is happening outside in London, in Berlin, in Tokyo, whatever you not, and I think sometimes we need reality checks, you have all these grand ideas and then you bring it back home and then, sometimes people are not willing to embrace it, or your politics, and you have to deal with the disappointments and what have you not. So that is more important to me.
Can I just two things is that one academic who does really great work is Tsitsi Elajaji, and she writes about Pan-Africanism with a capital P, which is the official version of Pan-Africanism, which is through the kind of state organizations, so the OAU, the AU, the same bodies that won't allow us to travel easily between and visit each other and that kind of thing. And then there's Pan-Africanism with a small p, the kind of thing that people are doing every single day. So we really, even within this Afropolitan discussion, and I mean Afropolitanism as it's most popularly conceived, erases the fact that people have always been consuming and interacting with each other through different kinds of cultures on the continent for a very long time. Music, which is the medium through which Tsitsi Jaji speaks about this through, is one of the sites that people are doing this, have been doing it for a very long time. If you go to Zimbabwe, rumba is big. We absolutely love people like Kanda Bongo Men, all of these things, and this is music that's traveled from Central Africa, East Africa. We've been doing that for a very long time. Even the fact that if I say to someone in my cousin in Harare, I'll say, Oga or Mr. Abu, whatever, people will know I'm talking about Nollywood, but we've always been consuming different kinds of culture, but not just the consuming, but the actual interaction between us has always been happening. So I think particularly, I just want to complicate this idea that Africans need to be global in a way that if I speak to the average Western white citizen, they know nothing about anything else outside of the West. But most of us, maybe because of the kinds of, consumer culture that we have here, have read about all kinds of things across the world. We've seen the James Bond, we've seen all kinds of things. Even the fact that when European audiences read for the first time just books from different contexts, and they're confronted with different words, they don't know how to interact with difference. But us, who've always known how to interact with difference, we never ask for glossaries, we never ask for explanations, because that's the very kind of cosmopolitan attitude that we're talking to from the beginning, right? So this idea, I think for me, when people say Africans need to be global, it sounds to me like Africans need to be Western, because nobody else has been told that they must know new context. When I go to in the West and some of the best institutions, they know nothing about my context, and they're even struggling. But I literally went to a class where we were talking about world literature, and they were lamenting, how do we read all of these different cultures, ours and theirs? And I was like, wow, some of us have been doing ours and yours for the very long time. It's quite simple. So that's why this global aspiration for me it sounds very coded with, you need to become more Western, when we've been internationalists for a very, very long time. And even with speaking about urbanity and thinking about modernity as necessarily a Western thing, we're in Nigeria, where the Yoruba culture has had a long culture of urbanity for a very, very long time. So again, this erasure that comes with some of these discourses is something that I think is really problematic. And even so, many of us who are different kinds of diaspora, we have a problematic relationship to home, I think, because very often this idea that I need to go home and show the people what I'm doing, or show, people have moved on, right? We need to learn that it's not just that we have things to teach, we have things to be taught in each of our contexts, I think, because I think it's just very problematic that we think that we're going to come and bring whatever great things we've learned overseas and then come bring it, and people are going to be grateful that we've shown them the things that we've learned overseas. It's not like that. People are learning much more than we do in our Western centers.
It's really great that you said that. I think it makes me think that the Africans on the continent, the term Afropolitan just makes me think that we need to define ourselves better and be more in charge on how we self-identify. There's my slight issue with Pan-Africanism is Black people, African people, were not a monolith. They're different layers, they're different identities. Colonialism, if you go and watch my documentary after this session, it played such a role in defining or separating northern Nigeria to southwest Nigeria and south Nigeria. And we need to sort of take more of a role, take charge in our different definitions, and also realize that being Black and African isn't a monolith. And I certainly don't think that Afropolitan it's not the best way to define Africans, because it's ambiguous. But I feel that we do need to break that African monolith, or even Africans in the West monolith. We need to sort of come up with different, not identities, but just sort of fragmentation almost.
I mean, we had this conversation yesterday, and I think sometimes within, again, some of these erasures that for me, I'm interested in a global Black future. I'm interested in a global, I mean, you know what I'm talking about, international. Can we use that? Because that's more leftist. So an international Black, a Pan-African Black identity. And when I say that is, when Pan-Africanism as we know it comes from the Caribbean, right? Those are the ones who were theorizing, and these were Africans who were not on the continent, but they had the vision about how do we bring all peoples of African descent together for a particular kind of politics, without then collapsing and saying that the experiences of Africans who are on the continent and were not displaced is the same as Africans who've been historically enslaved and are in the diaspora, and including then there's the recent immigrants or recent diaspora to the continent. So I think that within Pan-Africanism, as it was at least initially conceived, there's always been that diversity of experiences of peoples. There's a really beautiful anthology called Daughters of Africa, for example, and that's one literary way in which we see that you've got many African women across the world who are coming together, and you see that multiplicity in African identity. So it's just, I think maybe it's something about where are we looking for our narratives, because I don't know if the struggle, and I think it's to do with maybe positionality, where we're looking for definition. So of course, if I watch CNN, you know, that's a really bad example, too obvious example, but you know what I will think about myself. And I know if I read, I don't know, can you imagine the other day we were told about Karen Blixen with no irony? That was crazy. But anyway, if I read Karen Blixen, you know, out of Africa, which is, you know, I know what image of myself I'm going to get. But when I'm with fellow Africans and I locate myself in a particular kind of way, I don't know if we have the same struggle for identity. But something to just, preempt what we're going to talk about is, I think at the heart of Afropolitanism, at least the sympathetic reading, is that it's to do with a sense of loss and displacement, which I sympathize with because, you know, even for me being Zimbabwean but growing up in South Africa and now claiming South Africanness, I know what it's like to have to try and struggle for how do I claim this motherland, or whatever it is we want to call it, that I'm physically displaced from, but I have a yearning for, and it can never leave me. And I just think that there's more, or there's less problematic ways to deal with longing and loss and displacement than through the consumerist way that is looking for Western validation. That's a little segue into our...
Yeah, thank you for that. That was very smooth. So I was wondering whether you could say a bit more about how that is reflected in your most recent book, so the one I mentioned earlier.
So I think what I was trying to allude to just now is that a large part of the conversation about Afropolitanism is about Africans in the diaspora, people who are not in their home countries, longing for home or an identity outside of being able to be physically there. And for me, I've always struggled with that throughout my upbringing. I was born in Zimbabwe, but grew up mostly in South Africa. But Zimbabwe was always there in as far as my parents were always telling me about the country and were always visiting that, so it was never an abstract kind of place for me. But one place where you saw, particularly because we had a lot of diasporans having to move out of the country in the last 20 years, but even before that, we're some of the more early generation of people who had to leave the country. But there's a large diaspora population who is dealing with the sense of loss. So the kind of people who, when Oliver Mtukudzi comes to a country, they're all gonna go because they all want to hear the songs of home. And when the coup, not a coup, happened last year, that's when a lot of the tensions, you know, when Robert Mugabe was being ousted, that's when a lot of the tensions between people at home and people abroad were felt, because people at home, my aunt was telling me that most of her WhatsApp groups were with the news updates were from people outside who were just keeping a keen interest on what's happening, this is happening, and all of those kinds of things, because people wanted to go back home, but they couldn't. Many of them being asylum seekers, don't have passports, don't have 1, 2, 3, and that's the other story of diaspora that we don't always get, is the people who can't return home and don't have the 6 passports, is the people, if you had to speak about the number of scams that people have had to do in order to stay in their country, it's not a nice story. And so for me, in writing These Bones Arise Again, it's speaking through how do I relate to this moment through a particular moment of loss. In fact, and a big reality of diaspora, my grandmother passed away while I was gone. I was in the States, and I couldn't attend her funeral because it was just, we bury people very quickly. So it means that even if I got a ticket, I would have gotten there too late. And that's the kind of very personal kind of sense of loss that you have as a diaspora. Many of us don't get to bury our families. Many of us, let's say you have children, are living with parents, not living with us. And that's a deep part of the diaspora experience, is loss, and how do we connect and have a sense of home even when not being there. And so for me, it has been a lot through literature, through storytelling, engaging that. But how do you do that outside of displacing people at home and their narrative, so that it can't be that the Zimbabwean narrative is only the diaspora narrative. It needs to still center the people at home. But, you know, music, song, those are things that are important. But of course, if I have the opportunity, I'll visit. But, and it's not a closed chapter. I still feel very much that sense of longing and loss. And even now, as I think, do I want to stay in the States for so long? What happens if something happens again? I don't want a repeat of not going to be able to bury someone, you know, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think that's something I'm still working through. I don't have it all figured out. Yeah. Thank you.
So, Ade, based on what we've talked about now, and based on how you work with the term now, what do you think is in store for the term in the future? That's probably difficult to say, but how do you see yourself working with it from, this point?
I think as a creative, especially as a musician, there's a lot that still can be done with the term. It's still a work in progress. It is very problematic. We're very aware of that. But for me now, the question is, how do you take like a concept of Afropolitan vibes and travel within Nigeria, which is already complex in itself, and then take it to Nairobi, to Joburg, and to other places? And that is what is happening. And I mean, we're traveling with the music. We just recently went by road from Lagos to Mali, and that was quite an experience, public transport. So for me, it's like engaging these ideas, of Pan-Africanism, music, and collaborations. I think ultimately it's a collaborative adventure that we're going to embark on. We just want to work with as many people as possible, expand the idea, and it's not the end, because as I said, I came from Germany. I came here, it was a working term, and who knows, we might change it in next year or year after. Some people might say it's brand suicide or whatever. But I always understood that when it came to defining who I am, it is far more complex. And also as a returnee, and also trying to find my place, and also dealing with the fact that I have no home, and I'm at peace with that now. Those kind of things play in. But back to Afropolitan vibes, I think with music as such, and with the way everyone is connecting, especially pop music, Nigerian music, that is very, very exciting. Tying into what you said, people even feel threatened now by the Nigerian sound, like people went out, musicians in Kenya went out on the streets, like they're like, hey, these guys are taking over. We're very aggressive with what we're doing. But
we need to talk about Nigerian imperialism, cultural. We need to talk about Nigerian cultural.
We have the numbers. We have the numbers. It's not our fault.
We need to talk about. I am tired of Afrobeat. We have Kom, we have house, we have Kwaito, we have Rumba. Please.
You don't want to go to that Afrobeat something. Please,
and African food is not plantain or jollof. Please, we have other
Nigerian jollof.
There are
not Ghanaian jollof.
Other types of food. There are other more important debates about which food is best, not just jollof. Please. Oh, and my last gripe, there are other African prints, not only Kente and Ankara, there are many other types of African prints.
Who's that directed to, though? We love African culture. Who's that directed to? I mean, there's a lovely Jamaican restaurant in Lagos. Who's it directed to? Is it Nigerians?
Yes.
Why?
No. Okay, to be fair, let me explain what it's complicated, because when being in the West, and this is annoying, this being in the West thing, right? This is an issue, but
why are you centering them?
You know what's irritating? Being in the West, African means West African. So a lot of times I always have to be like, hello, Southern Africa. Hello, it's not. So literally, I remember going to a party for Africans, right? And you think, oh, Africans, But then what it means is that it's going to be Afrobeats. And sure, we can all shaku, whatever we do, cool, right? It's fun. Then I went to the DJ. I was like, hey, DJ, please play Babes, we'll do more, And I'm thinking, because she's the biggest thing right now in this Southern Africa. She's traveling. We play, what was it, Wololo? Who's the South Africans here? Southern Africans, you know the song? Yeah, that's so muted. This is why they don't play your music. You need to be as confident. You need to be as confident as the Nigerians, right? You need to also be abrasive and aggressive and confrontational like the Nigerians are, And yes.
Security.
Zimbabweans are very polite. Anyway.
No, not really.
And so we played the gom, and so we danced when it was the Afro beats. We danced, but then when you put gom, you left the dance floor. I do Vosho. You don't even know what it is, but I know what Shaku is.
Look at how we're looking at you.
We'll do it. And then when I want to wear African print, I'm like, no, in South Africa we have shwe, we have all kinds of different prints. It's not just Ankara sometimes. I mean, it's easiest, I won't lie, when you want to wear African print, it's easiest to just go and get the West African materials. But I think this is a very serious conversation about the erasure and the kind of dominance of particular kinds of cultures.
I'd like to respond to that, because literally I remember 2 years ago when I was at Ake, 2 years ago, and you and Kina and someone else, you were on a panel and you said that Africans don't talk to each other enough. Now, I know between Nigeria and South Africa, there's a lot more cultural exchange musically. Yes. Again, bringing someone Western, I know Diplo's doing a lot of fusion African music. I know it's slightly ambiguous, but bear with me. I think then you said on the panel that we need to talk to each other more creatively, politically, and that's not really happening. And then the second answer to that question is that there are a lot of there are Nigerians in places I'm surprised, they're not, they're Nigerians in Ukraine, there's a huge...
There's also Zimbabweans everywhere.
No, there's a huge I think we're the largest black
I think 1 in 4 Africans is Nigerian.
Yeah,
I think something crazy like that.
So it's just something in that statistic. So I think it's also to do with it. I don't think it's Nigerians saying that. I mean, I don't mean to generalize. I just feel like where there's a majority, naturally there'll be a little bit of and a majority doesn't suggest it's better than, because sometimes, and I'm going to say this to my detriment, I don't always like all of the music that comes out of here. It's not always... I don't always... but I think that there needs to be more cross-cultural exchange.
If I may add to that, while you were sharing your thoughts, what we keep forgetting is while you're on the continent, the concept of Africa, being a Pan-Africanist, being an African, it's quite alien. I'll tell you why. Because I became an African when I went to Germany. You know how it is when you're... why do I say so? Because being in an environment like Germany, where all of us are now speaking a language we didn't grow up with and all that, it eased the communication in terms of exchange. People from Congo, people from Zimbabwe, people from Cape Verde, and all of that, So there are very few spaces where you can actually communicate with people beyond the colonies. And I think that is something we always have to remember,
But I'm disagreeing with you because, again, being a historical, in Southern Africa, so what I actually should have mentioned about how I regained or worked through the sense of loss was going back to history and seeing that, I'm not the first person to travel between this border. Historically, within Southern Africa, for example, we've had African migrants moving up and down. Very few people would know someone like Hugh Masekela is actually Zimbabwean, and we know that actually Zimbabwean means nothing because Rhodesia, that's a colonial border, whatever. But the point being that we have been moving around each other for a very long time. And I think maybe because we have particular ideas of what it means to come together, that's where we miss the fact that the exchange has been happening. Whether even if we're talking about, South Africa's political exiles going to, in Time Up,
I think you're going to have to wrap up very quickly, and then we're going to open it to the floor.
Okay.
One sentence. Huh?
What I'm saying is that I think we're missing the history of African migration and the fact that we have had the cross-cultural communication for a very long time. It's not only starting now with the invention of the plane. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So let's open it to the floor. Any questions? And microphone, please.
Can we go to Afropolitan vibes?
No, we don't. We don't like Zimbabweans coming.
It's fine.
So,
and please keep your questions brief.
In fact, it's not a question; it's a comment. And that
Comments
is that as a Ghanaian.
So we've got a question.
It's a comment, but as a Ghanaian and someone whose mother...
Your sister.
Yeah, someone whose mother came to Festac I find it really odd, and this is a problem of archives, is that we've sat through a whole conversation as though bringing people together from the wider Pan-African black space is something new, and this is a problem of archives. And I would need my fellow Nigerians to not erase Festac from your own memories, because it was bigger than anything we have ever done, and it was amazing. My mother came back with archives, and we keep losing ourselves along the way. It makes me wonder, 50 years from now, what are we going to be saying about Ake?
Yes.
Thank you.
Can we just clarify for people who don't know what Festac is? Festac.
Telling Nigerians.
I think
Oh, you know? Okay.
No, Nigerians will tell their friends.
let's move to the second row, the lady on the second row, and then the lady behind her afterwards. Thank you.
Oh, hello. I'm Sierra Leonean, and I knew about Festac, and everybody knows what Festac is. But there's a question the gentleman in the middle is just about to, sorry, I've forgotten your name, is that when you're on the continent, when you live in Africa, you're really not concerned about being African because you're already African. So I just wanted to ask the question is, why do you feel so strongly that we should be Pan-African? Why is it so important to you or to the continent? Because we know that Nkrumah and everyone else were at the very beginning when we were coming out of colonialism, that Pan-Africanism was a way of waking us up all to our plight. But one would hope that now that everyone is independent, right? So I just wanted to know, why do you think Pan-Africanism is the thing that we should all be going for, when particularly our individual countries are still not even at a level to look after themselves? So that's a question for any one of you to take.
Can I just give sorry, I know it was for Ade, but just to respond to so a non-Western centered view, being Zimbabwean, and if you ask me what I am, first and foremost, I'm an African, right? That's my identity. But when I go to Home Affairs, I cannot say I'm an African. I must say you're South African, you're Zimbabwean, you're 1, 2, 3. And that's important because, for example, South Africa has dealt with a lot of, in the reports, I'm sure many of you have seen what is called xenophobia, or some people call it Afrophobia. And it's not just a violent response to all foreigners, it's specifically black foreigners, right? And particularly in South Africa, the country does not see itself as part of the continent. And that's a historical baggage from apartheid, where even citizenship was not something that was up for black people. They only became citizens of the country after the fall of apartheid, right? So citizenship has always been anti-black. But even the borders around many of these things, I think to recognize the damage still done by a lot of the colonial borders. So if I still see myself as Zimbabwean, South African, the kind of violence that we're meting out on each other is literally costing us lives because we don't see each other as fellow Africans, and I have to hold on to a particular colonial border. Even with knowing my own history within Southern Africa, it's knowing that if it hadn't been for a referendum by white settlers in the 1920s, South Africa and Zimbabwe might have possibly been the same country, for example, but yet we're fighting over something that wasn't created by us. So I don't think it's irrelevant to think about Pan-Africanism. It's actually a bread and butter issue for many of the poorest amongst us. So I think it's not. Mm-hmm.
Why you felt Pan-Africanism is the way forward, because if you look to the individual, the poor uneducated person, they are only interested in their own. In their country. Person? Pardon?
A poor person.
So if you take someone that's uneducated and illiterate, the reason why you have the fighting going on is because they're so individual and they see the other individual as, even though they're black, as the enemy coming in. So I wanted you to be able to explain to me why Pan-Africanism is the solution to giving us those people the identity. Why is it so important?
So I think it's beyond merely identity politics in the way that's what, because I think when we're speaking about the Pan-Africanism, it is dealing with the political issues that cause a lot of these divides. So if I talk about xenophobia or Afrophobia in South Africa, I'm going to have to historicize it within the fact that South Africa is an anti-black society, it's a society with high levels of income inequality, where it's black people who are the face of poverty. So when I have an issue around unemployment in South Africa, I'm not going to fight with my white employer who then hires cheap black immigrants from Zimbabwe and then will deport them at the end of the month so that he doesn't have to pay them, right? That's how you then create that infighting amongst them. We don't talk about that. It's not just to say Africans need to see themselves differently. I need to talk about the politics between countries. We need to talk about, does South Africa support Zimbabwean citizens when they're saying they want Mugabe to get out, for example? It's talking about the very bread and butter kinds of interests in politics. So we're joking about just the music, do we listen to each other's music and that kind of thing. It's not just that, it's do we show up for each other when it matters most, particularly at a political level. And that's when it begins to, all of those things mean that when Ade comes into my country and gets a job, I'm going to see him as the enemy because I can't fight Pernille because of the anti-blackness within my country. I will, in South Africa, for example, we actually literally have pictures of black people killing black people, but you know that a black life doesn't mean much, but if I kill her life, Lord knows, if I take her life, Lord knows the entire world is going to stop because a white foreigner was killed. So I think some of these things, we have to contextualize it within broader issues around neocolonialism, income inequality, and all of those things. And that's how, I don't know if this is making sense, but just to speak to the fact that it's not just we must see each other as the same, but it's also really political, and it affects the people who are least, who have the least income or least means amongst us more than anyone else, not just the 2 passport holders amongst us.
Thank you. Okay, so the lady on the 3rd row, yeah.
Hi, my name is Jennifer, and I'm Ugandan, and I'm going to say something that will make everybody hate me afterward. So, you said that Afropolitan is unnecessary as a term.
Who? Could you clarify?
One of the panel members. Yeah, and another one, I think that was Panashe. You said that it was meant for Western consumption. Now, first of all, there is an Afropolitan out there who's not sitting on that stage, okay? All of you 3 are connected to the continent, but there's a child out there in the West, and I'm pretty getting emotional about this. These are children born to people like me. These are children who are born to, let me say, I'll limit myself to Ugandans, but I know most Afropolitans are Nigerians. Now, these children, so mom and dad were thrown out of Uganda during Idi Amin's regime, okay? And something horrible happened to them. And they had their children in Britain. Those children were given clan names, everything. But they don't speak the language, they don't have a relationship with Uganda, okay? Now, when those children are applying for anything or they are registering anywhere, they are forced to feeling that they are African. But they don't speak the language, they have no relationship with this continent. And often these children are taken to church because we are very religious as Africans. And I will force my son, help him, nudge him to marry a good, nice Ugandan girl, okay? And they will, those 2, he's married a girl who has no relationship with Uganda at all. But I will insist, you're from this clan, you name these names. So those children are also brought up as African, but they take African, but they are not Africans. So they've found themselves this term, Afropolitan. And you're sitting there saying it's unnecessary. For me, by you claiming that there's no need for it, and at the same time you're aware that it's ambiguous, that it is elusive, and therefore it might be catering for a wide range of people, could you be possibly erasing the presence of these children, of these people, and their realities, and perhaps alienating them further from the continent? Because that's what I hear from them all the time. They hate us. When we talk about our realities, they hate us. They think we are pretending. They could be mixed middle class. They could be upper class. They could be absolutely rich. Why not?
So I'll speak to my personal issue with the term is that what's wrong with African? What's wrong with Nigerian? What's wrong with Zimbabwean? Why must it be Afropolitan? You can be, in the Black and British panel yesterday, you can be British and Nigerian, you can be British and Ugandan. Why do we have to have this special cinnamon spice term, which is often used for consumerism? What's wrong with the term African? That's my personal issue.
Yeah, but that is you. That is not them. You are imposing your views.
It's an opinion. I definitely am not imposing. It's just an opinion.
But I think what is important...
I think we're going to have to keep it brief.
Just go
And I just want to keep it very brief. I think these communities already have terms that they're working with. If you look at the Dutch Africans, the French Africans, the German Africans, Swiss, and they work with terms like Afropian, they work with terms like Afro-German, Afro-Swiss, and all that. I think they already have terms that they're engaging to reflect the fact. No, and I think there's no division there whatsoever. I understand that you're trying to point out that there's that possibility and that danger of division. But when you look at the movements, and I can only speak of the Black German organizations, Africans are involved just as well as mixed race people, just as Black Germans that are there in the third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation. Everyone is trying to negotiate their space as people of color in a xenophobic, Eurocentric environment.
So I want to clarify my point, Jennifer. I think the key thing here for me is that I'm responding to the most, two things I'm responding to. So I'm responding to that main article that speaks to what Afropolitanism is supposed to be. So it specifically speaks to a multiple passport holding 1 to 1 to 3 type of African, and even particularly with the Mbembe article, where he speaks about a post-victim mentality, which I read as this in the same vein as we'd read post-racial kinds of politics. I'm not seeking to erase the diasporic experience. I am a member of the diaspora, even within the continent. And that's why I mentioned the need to have a sympathetic reason, a sympathetic reading of Afropolitanism. If it is coming from a space of loss and trying to re-engage with a place that you cannot physically be there to engage with, there are ways in which we can do that. I don't think that it needs to be the consumerist kind of way. And all of us have our different kinds of, different points at which ways in which we have engaged our home countries at different points in time. And I think it's fair for people to say, hey, Sissy, I don't know if this is the right way to be engaging Zimbabwe right now. Is this the right way to be engaging your fellow citizens? And sometimes I get frustrated with what people at home say about us, but I also want to be sympathetic to, okay, why do they feel frustrated with how I'm wanting to engage this imagined home country that has moved on from the country that I left when I was younger. So it's just to say, let's be critical about what this term is. There may be years and decades, and I think that this is just not the way that we want to engage with it, because it does perpetuate a very kind of harmful, neoliberal, ahistorical kinds of politics. That's what we're critiquing. We're not critiquing that people want to connect with hope. I think that's brilliant that people want. I was at Africa Rights earlier this year, and many Black, British, and particularly Black or British Nigerian people, I saw a number of plays with people speaking to, how do I connect with home? How do I connect with that history? And I think that's far more productive than simply saying, I'm going to have an African version of Girls. I'm going to have an African version of 1, 2, 3. There are people who are doing deep and meaningful work. And we can even look at someone like Ade, for example. This is important work that you're doing, connecting with home. I also consider it literally is about how do I connect with my home country, and I can still do that without being an Afropolitan. So I think maybe you're not hearing us, but it's not about erasing far. I think we're critiquing the particular neoliberal kind of politics that come out of Afropolitanism.
Maybe we can continue that particular discussion afterwards. Do we have time for more questions? How are we doing for do we have time for one more question, for instance? Okay, all right. Okay. Maybe just one? Okay, one. Because we haven't heard from any men in the audience. I think that's a shame. So let's... Yes, so the second row, the gentleman in the blue top, do we have a microphone for him? And just, please keep it brief because we have a film to watch in 3 minutes.
So this has been a fantastic panel and really, really enlightening and illuminating. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts with regards to Africans on the American continent, or African Americans with regards to this issue of Afropolitanism.
That's going to be a long discussion.
We can talk later.
Yes. Just one comment from one of you. You choose.
I think identity is fluid. There are no fixed or essentializing identities, and there's room for everyone to identify as to who or how they want to identify, whether it's gender, nationality, race, sex. However, it's important we look at how we're identifying ourselves and at whose detriment it might be. And if we're attaching an identity to capitalism or consumerism, then it becomes dangerous and, well, not dangerous, nobody's gonna die, but it becomes unfair. So that's my comment.
Thank you very much. So I think we're going to continue that discussion afterwards, if that's okay. On that note, I'd like to thank our panelists. I think, okay, sorry about that. Just a quick, brief message. We've got a book signing outside where you can also buy the book. Yes, so please go and do that, and then go and watch the film afterwards at 6 o'clock. Great, thank you so much.